As a brief disclaimer, this video discusses the supremacist beliefs held by the infamous sex criminal Jeffrey Epstein, with said beliefs motivating his actions as detailed in the Epstein Files. I wholeheartedly condemn these beliefs, and the purpose of this video is to provide historical and ideological context in the interest of seeking a greater understanding of the situation. I am in no way glorifying him, his beliefs, nor his actions. Again, I do not support these beliefs. Thank you.
Do not listen to that.
Thank you, man.
I know how it feels. Nah. They're not worth it, bro.
Yeah, you're right. I was tripping.
What's your name?
Jeffrey Epstein.
So the Epstein Files have dropped recently, at least some of them, and after a few days, there have mainly been two reactions. There's the low information normie class whose minds are totally blown, and then there are the schizos and chuds who have known about this stuff for years and are clown-pilled to the point that it barely matters. Assuming you're a member of the latter category, I'm sure you can relate to the experience of normies frantically asking if you've heard about the latest horrific crime against humanity that you first saw on Poll a decade ago. Better late than never, I suppose, but this often leads to the awkward question of what now, to which the answer is nothing. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but as far as I can tell, this email drop is no different than the rest of what we've been given regarding Epstein, and that it's largely a diversion. The crazy stuff that normies are melting down over is all alleged. You know, I'm not saying that George Bush wasn't on a yacht with a bunch of elites where they dismembered and ate baby intestinal fecal matter after watching interracial gang rapes and cutting a guy's feet with scimitars after violating him, but we need more than a testimony where even the agent writing the stuff down didn't believe it. As far as I can tell, the big stuff is all like this. You've got a 2013 email between Epstein and a former French diplomat who's currently a World Economic Forum member, where they compare white girls to shrimp and talk about removing the heads and keeping the bodies. I think we all have an idea of what that means, but can you prove it? Keep in mind, this is what you're allowed to see. Epstein was first arrested for soliciting a minor in 2006, and it took 13 years to finally raid him in 2019. Of the mountains of evidence accumulated from decades of deviancy, how much of that do you think will be officially released? How much of that do you think hasn't been destroyed in the 20 years since? I've long stopped caring about the files for this reason. Of course, I'd like them to be released, but I don't think the government will ever give us what people are looking for, with this recent batch of emails serving as an example of that. So, is that it? It's over? Never began? Well, no. There is one major thing of note regarding the recent Epstein file drop, which is the confirmation that the Epstein operation was explicitly an ethnic one. And really, everyone suspected that to some degree. Ghislaine Maxwell's father was a huge Mossad guy, but going through the emails, it's clear to see that it wasn't just an Israeli operation, it was a Jewish one. Epstein says verbatim that he represents the Rothschilds, a highly powerful international banking family connected to Zionism, who directly created the current state of Israel through the Balfour Declaration in World War I, with the Rothschilds and other Zionists potentially buying Churchill for his debts, which then led to opposition with Nazi Germany, and the rest is history. It's worth noting that this particular email was sent to Silicon Valley tech mogul and co-ethnic Peter Thiel, a friend of Elon Musk who started PayPal with him, and the longtime mentor of Vice President J.D. Vance who put him in the White House, on the subject of networking and international power. Epstein elaborates on these subjects a few other times, like how in a conversation with the renowned professor and AI entrepreneur Roger Schenck, he says that the way the Jew makes money is by selling concepts and operating outside the framework of non-Jews. A direct quote is, "Let the Goyim deal in the real world. Let the Goyim toil in the rat race and work themselves into an early grave, while the Jew operates on a separate plane of existence, making money through non-tangible means like academia and markets, banking and pornography." I'd like to reiterate that this is Epstein speaking to other Jews. This isn't some extremist conspiracy theory. When Epstein speaks to a Mark Fisher about how Jewish souls are more valuable than the souls of non-Jews, that's not because an anti-Semite had a gun to his head and forced him to say those things. Likewise, the conversation with Fisher, in which the latter tells Epstein that if he's going to breed, it must be with a Jewish girl, sounds conspiratorial, but it's real, and that's not an uncommon concern within Jewish communities. Many will claim that Epstein specifically was an ethnosupremacist, exist, when Judaism as a whole prohibits marriage between Jews and Gentiles. In fact, Israel as a country does not permit intermarriage. In other words, Israel as a country does not permit Jews to miscegenate with non-Jews. The secular component does not detract from the fact that the national policy is no race mixing. I mention Israel because whenever you speak on this stuff, there's an immediate knee-jerk response of not all. It's not all Jews. Epstein views Gentiles as inferior, and so did his many powerful friends, but this recurring pattern isn't indicative of anything broader. And there is a sliver of truth to that. The secular 40-year-old Jewish truecell working minimum wage at Taco Bell wasn't invited to the island. However, not all is often said to discourage pattern recognition. Yes, some people do bad things. In fact, they may even be statistically overrepresented if you look at the numbers, but it's not all members of that group, and therefore you can't make broad statements regarding groups as a whole. There's a phrase that comes to mind: not all, but always. It's not all members of a group, but it always seems to be a member of that group. It's not every single one, but there's a pattern there. Epstein himself acknowledges this pattern. In an email, he reminisces how he was at dinner with a bunch of right-wing guys, and he asked why they're so anti-Semitic. One of them stated that historically Jews have held a lot of power behind the scenes, to which Epstein asks for an example. The guy points at Epstein and everyone starts laughing. Epstein is indignant when someone says, "How else do you explain how the past 3 days we've seen princes, prime ministers, other officials, emissaries, and 2 presidents?" To which Epstein laughs and says, "Guilty." It's like a sketch from a sitcom, complete with a laugh track. But the craziest thing to me is that influential ethnic sex predator Jeffrey Epstein is like, why are you guys so anti-Semitic? Jews hold a disproportionate amount of power? Source? It's insane that Jeffrey Epstein is whining about anti-Semitism, playing the victim and crying foul before laughing about it immediately after. It's relatively small, but something of note is the common usage of the term Goyim, or Goy for short. It's a Yiddish term that Jews use to refer to non-Jews. Gentile is the official term, while Goy is more of a slur. The email about Goyim slaving in the real world while Jews operate above it all really sums it up. It's a demeaning term used to look down on the other 99.8% of the global population. The mindless cogs in a machine designed to benefit the chosen few, which Epstein lays out in that same email. I'd like to reiterate that the Epstein operation was explicitly an ethnically Jewish one. Epstein is on record favoring blonde-haired, blue-eyed white girls, and to my understanding, all of the victims have been Gentiles. None of them were Jewish. And of course they weren't. As award-winning journalist and media consultant Michael Wolff said to Epstein in 2017, "It's a war between Jews and non-Jews, with Jews presently winning. It doesn't matter if you don't see the world that way. In fact, the vast majority of people still think that Jews are white. Well, they're not. And Epstein's sex trafficking was an ethnic attack specifically targeting the children of non-Jews. The term they use for Gentile women is Shiksa, derived of the Hebrew word sheketz, which means abomination and impure. In other words, they consider women of all other races to be whores. But this is nothing new. There's a long history of Jews sexualizing and demeaning Shiksas. A 2021 article from The Guardian details the prevalence of pairing Shiksas of Jews in Hollywood films, as well as the fact that burlesque shows starred Gentiles rather than Jewish women, as the latter were thought of as pure, as opposed to the whorish, unclean Shiksa. This article was, of course, written by a Jewish woman, who celebrates the Jewish domination of Hollywood, which from its inception was always Semitic. On a similar note, pornography as a whole is the industry of whoring out and degrading Shiksa, with the vast majority of the porn industry having ties to Jews. Al Goldstein, founder of the pornographic magazine Screw, which is described as a pioneer in bringing hardcore pornography into the American mainstream during the late 60s and early 70s, infamously stated that Jews are overrepresented in the porn industry because, quote, "We think that Christ sucks. Catholicism sucks. We don't believe in authoritarianism, and pornography is a way of defiling Christian culture." You'll note that in this statement, it's acknowledged that porn is a subversive weapon against Christians, and really the Goyim as a whole. This isn't exactly a secret, however, considering how in 2002, in a conflict with Palestine, Israel broadcasted pornography for West Bank TV stations as they occupied the area. On the subject of Israel, it's also worth noting, of course, the vast amounts of human trafficking and the prostitution of Gentile women from Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic states, South Africa, and the Dominican Republic. In 1998, it was noted that more than 95% of the women deported from Israel for illegal prostitution were repatriated to the former Soviet Union, with a professor from Hebrew University in Israel estimating that 70% of women working in prostitution were from Russia and other former Soviet republics. Considering how these women didn't even speak the language, I think you can imagine how they got there and how they were treated. As with all of this, it was ethnically motivated sex slavery. To reiterate what Wolf said in 2017, it's a war between Jews and non-Jews, Jews presently winning. Now, of course, not all Jews, but it's enough Jews to notice some patterns. People always want to blame the Zionists or the Frankists or the Canaanites, but you'll notice that it's never a Gentile. When Epstein mocks one of his victims for saying that Jesus is watching over her, to which his friend replies that Epstein should dress as Jesus when he sees her, remember what Goldstein said about hating Christ, alongside the fact that according to Jewish scripture, Jesus Christ is a false prophet who is burning in hell in boiling excrement.
Jewish point of view, where we don't believe in the divinity of Christ. I think that there you can make an argument that the Gospels, which were written...
He was just a prophet.
Right? No. We don't even believe he was a prophet.
What do you think he was? What do you guys think he was?
What do I think he was historically? I think he was a Jew who tried to lead a revolt against the Romans and got killed for his trouble. Just like a lot of other Jews at that time who were crucified for trying to lead revolts against the Roman and got killed for their trouble.
When you read the emails about gene testing and designer babies, and you see the talks of potential cannibalism, consider the fact that these people have a slur for the rest of the population, who they consider genetically and spiritually inferior. The sad thing is that very little of this is new information. Again, patterns. But it's nice to have some confirmation, like the email where Epstein discusses attending the World Jewish Congress dinner with the Rothschilds. If you were to talk about the ethnic component of the elites a month ago, you'd be discredited as a conspiratorial anti-Semite, but now you can literally source Jeffrey Epstein when speaking about this stuff. I would say that this is the silver lining to the Epstein Files. For the past few years, the country has been in uproar over the conflict in Gaza, and for the past year, the Trump admin was criticized for not releasing the files. A massive spotlight has been in this direction for years, only for the Epstein Files to reveal that the whole operation came from a place of deep ethnic hatred. Mainstream sources have simmered down after this revelation, but what about the people? I never thought I'd see the day that normies finally came around on Pizzagate, but here we are. And while a lot of the reactions I see are no doubt more so indicative of the sphere I'm in rather than the layman's opinion, I truly feel that in the wake of the Epstein Files, this is the best opportunity in decades to push the Overton window. Right now, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of anger. Every day, something new comes up, like Pam Bondi supposedly redacting information from the files on account of anti-Semitism. There's a lot of outrage, but nowhere for it to go. And so, this is the best opportunity in decades to provide answers for certain questions. All of that said, this brings us to the question of why now? For that matter, why release this stuff at all? Some will argue that the government had to release the files, but they overshot that deadline by 40 days, and realistically, they could have just destroyed them, which I assume has already been done to the damning things everyone wants to see. Well, if you consider the timeline, this file drop came at the end of January, and about a week later, the biggest sporting event of the year happened. I think the intention was demoralization. You see normies chimping over the files, and you think, oh man, is something finally happening? And then a week later, you see 100 times that amount of people going wild over Goyball, and it's like, never mind. It really is just bread and circuses. Supposedly in Brazil, a few years ago, 81% of the population was watching the World Cup. That's 173 million people. 173 million people could do a lot of things, including radically change the government and system they live in. Well, they didn't do that. They all went back to their crime-infested favelas, and nothing ever happened. The Super Bowl is essentially our equivalent. Supposedly, the viewership peaked at around 138 million viewers. That's about 40% of the country, and it's a reality check that the masses are still very much asleep. Again, I think the timing was very much intentional. They dropped the files and gave the noticers a sliver of hope right before the biggest sporting event of the year that hijacked the discourse. And now the normies have moved on to arguing about how gay the halftime show was, or how the Turning Point alternative was cringe, rather than the ethnic hatred motivating the blackmail child abuse operation they've whined about for years. And even then, the reason I call the files a diversion is because they distract from immediate issues that will affect your daily life, like Virginia's brand new governor Abigail Spanberger, who upon taking the role immediately put in a bill to remove the minimum sentencing for felonies such as manslaughter, rape, and child sex crimes. They're also putting in a bill on account of first-generation Bangladeshi immigrant Saddam Aslam Salim, who's a senator, to ban so-called assault weapons, which is defined as center-fire semi-automatics, which comprises of most guns. They're also putting in a bill discriminating against white men in government contracting, where women and minorities are favored in contracts under 100K because fuck you, white man, quote also Abigail Spanberger, who's Jewish and not white. Now, to be fair, Spanberger's opposition was a female Jamaican anti-Trumper first-generation immigrant Republican named Winsome Earl Sears, so that's modern politics for ya. It's worth noting that the prior governor, Glenn Youngkin, was a Republican who won on trans issues after a boy in a skirt raped a girl in a school bathroom. Why the GOP decided to follow him up with an anti-Trump black female immigrant, I have no idea. But the point is that focusing on big picture shit like Epstein distracts from local issues with major consequences like Spanberger and her Indian cohort, who immediately began raping Virginia. As stated, I want the files released. Really, I think everyone does. But in the very likely event that we'll never get what people are looking for, which is names, evidence, and heads rolling, I think the biggest takeaway from all this is the ethnic angle. In conclusion, I'd like to take a look at a certain ad from the Super Bowl, namely the Blue Square Alliance ad, an organization dedicated to standing up to Jewish hate. In this ad, a meek Semitic manlet is ruthlessly terrorized by two 90s sitcom characters, as in they put a sticky note on his backpack that reads Dirty Jew, which gets the attention of everyone within a mile radius, causing his diverse classmates, mostly female, to point and laugh. He reaches his locker, sees the note, and right as the Showa flashbacks begin, a mystery meat mulatto comes up and says not to listen to them, as he knows how it feels. Presumably, he too can relate to the Jewish experience. This is where the ad ends, but the original version goes on a bit longer, wherein the heroic black guy is like, "She, little n***, what's your name, cuh?" To which the harmless nebbish Jew replies, "Me? They, my name is Israel Child Rapestein." $15 million, by the way, but can you really put a price tag on brainwashing the Goyim? It's peak propaganda, where the white man ridicules the Jew as other ethnic groups watch, only for the savior to be a diverse man of unknown ethnic origins. He's black, though. There's so much to take away from this. It reminds me of the famous quote that America is a melting pot. Specifically, it reminds me of the quote's origin, a British Jew named Israel Zangwill, a close friend of Theodore Hearst, who is the father of the Zionist movement. The quote comes from a play that Zangwill wrote about a Russian Jew who pursues a beautiful young Christian woman, something Zangwill never did, as he had children with a Jewish woman named Edith Ayrton. He also never moved to America, yet he was happy to talk about how the true American is a fusion of all races, perhaps resembling the Ubermenschen Gigamut who we see defending the Jew in the ad. Really, the least surprising thing here is that the golem in the ad is black, at least partially. There's a long history of Jews trying to ingratiate themselves within the black community. After all, in the words of renowned comedian, producer, political commentator, and television host John Stewart Leibowitz,
the Jewish community and the black community, we should be together. Jews and blacks we shouldn't fight, there shouldn't be tension. Jews and blacks should get together and get whitey. I think...
I will say this about black people. They should hate us. Black people should hate white people. I mean, I'm glad that they're trying at least to be nice to us, but we really fuck them over almost at every turn. Jews and blacks fighting each other. That's so fucking stupid. Jews and blacks should get together and get whitey.
You'll note that Leibowitz is trying to form a sense of kinship between the two aggrieved races, just as we see in the Super Bowl ad. Of course, this is a false pretense. Blacks also fit under the category of goy, and they even have their own slur in Yiddish, which is schwarze, so as you may imagine, the relations between blacks and Jews are often tenuous at best. The Super Bowl ad was generally received poorly. It has an abysmal ratio on YouTube, and the comments are turned off. You may think it's absurd to put this out right after the Epstein Files dropped, but remember that Epstein himself cried anti-Semitism after a lifetime of ethnic hatred against the Goyim and abusing their children, only to laugh about it a moment later. I've said it a few times now, but so long as we remain in an info war, the ethnic component is the single most important takeaway from the files. This is one of the very few opportunities we've been allowed since the end of World War II. And so, despite my better judgment, I'm a bit hopeful that maybe, just maybe, one day the Goyim will know. Either way, see you next time.